time. And if you can unmute yourself, please.
There you go.
For the last 3 years, I've been working on a project I'm calling My Civil War Stories. I first took an interest in the Civil War at the time of its centennial when I was 10. And over my lifetime, I keep finding points of connection to that terrible time in our history. I have realized there was a reason for this. The Civil War is everywhere around us, and my lifelong awareness has allowed me to see it. It is the fulcrum of the American experiment, and as William Faulkner once wrote, the past is not dead, it's not even past. Many of the issues we deal with today, race, the nature of citizenship, voting rights, the size and reach of our national government, the rights of indigenous people, were all part of the great and catastrophic struggle at the center of our history. So come along and join me as I share one of my Civil War stories. Silas. Few people realize that even as our nation was fighting the most terrible war in its history, we were also fighting a second war on our western frontier. This is a story from that little-known other war. As I am writing this, I am in the research library of History Colorado in Denver. I have before me on the table a letter dated April 20, 1865, and signed, "Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Silas S. Soule, Captain, Veterans Battalion, 1st Colorado Cavalry." Silas Stillman Soule was my great-grandfather's 5th cousin. I first heard of Silas when my cousin Link Soule sent my brother Mark and me an email with a link to an online account of Silas and his involvement in the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864, one of the darkest chapters in US history. I must have been busy when I received it because I only glanced at it and closed it, intending to come back later. Then Mark reminded me of it shortly before I was to fly to Denver in July of 2019. This time I followed up, reading what I could online and ordering a biography. The more I read, the more I was drawn into Silas's story. I vowed to spend time in Denver looking into his remarkable life and death. Silas Soule was born in Bath, Maine in 1838 and spent part of his boyhood in Revere, Massachusetts. His parents were radical abolitionists who went so far as to name Silas's older brother, William Lloyd Garrison Soule, after the publisher of the Boston anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. When Silas was 17, his family moved to the Kansas Territory. They were part of the Jayhawker movement, who devoted their lives to ensure that when Kansas became a state, it would do so as a free state, outlawing slavery. As Silas grew into adulthood, he became known as a fun-loving young man, a singer and actor, handsome and with an eye for the ladies. He had a serious side as well, that throughout his life pushed him to live out the progressive values he learned from his parents. Silas was soon in the thick of the fight that became known as Bleeding Kansas, working with John Brown to bring escaped enslaved people from Missouri to freedom. This often involved exchanges of gunfire with pro-slavery elements. He once joined a group of men who snuck into Missouri in the dark of night to release an abolitionist who had been captured and imprisoned there. Silas came up with a ruse, using his acting ability to trick the guard into opening the cell. They brought the escapee back to Kansas, where the rescuers became known as the immortal 10. Silas and his brother William caught the bug when gold was discovered in Colorado, and they went west with the Pike speakers. Failing at that, Silas found odd jobs until the Civil War broke out. The Colorado Territory was recruiting men to counter Confederate forces moving north through New Mexico, and Silas joined the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He fought at the Battle of Glorieta Pass near Santa Fe in northern New Mexico, turning the rebel forces back. With the threat from the Southerners gone, the 1st Colorado was converted into a cavalry unit tasked with protecting Colorado settlers and the Santa Fe Trail from Indian attacks. By 1864, Silas had been promoted to captain and given command of D Company, stationed at Fort Lyons in southeastern Colorado, under the command of Colonel John Chivington. That April, 3 Cheyenne, 2 men and a woman, approached the fort in response to a government order demanding that the local tribes come and live peacefully near the fort. They brought a letter with terms for a peace agreement, offering to release 7 white prisoners. The story here gets complicated, as stories always do when people with completely divergent worldviews clash. A detachment of about 130 soldiers from Fort Lyons under the command of Major Edward Wynkoop was sent to meet the tribal leaders at their encampment in Kansas, bringing 4 Indian prisoners to be exchanged. Silas was one of the junior officers in the troop. 4 days later, they approached the Cheyenne and Arapaho village. Arrayed before the teepees were 700 to 800 warriors, painted, mounted, and formed for battle. An agreement was reached that Wynkoop, Soule, and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, and a translator, would meet the 9 chiefs of the assembled bands for a preliminary meeting. The soldiers were to arrive without any weapons. I can't imagine what they must have been feeling as they walked unarmed away from their compatriots into the camp. The meeting was tense, but Chief Blackkettle of the Cheyenne and Chief Left Hand of the Arapaho set a measured tone, praising Wynkoop for coming through the fire, despite the danger to himself and his men. The chiefs agreed that if Wynkoop withdrew his force 12 miles, they would come with their answer in 2 days' time. Wynkoop did so, and at the appointed time, a delegation, including Left Hand and Blackkettle, approached the camp, bringing 4 hostages, including a young girl named Isabel Eubanks, who was crying for her mother. The prisoners were exchanged, and Wynkoop agreed to arrange a meeting between the chiefs and John Evans, governor of the Colorado Territory. The soldiers returned to the fort with the good news. Wynkoop was able to convince Chivington and Governor Evans to meet with the delegation of chiefs. They, the white and Indian leaders, agreed to convene a council at Camp Weld outside Denver. In attendance at the council were 7 chiefs, including Blackkettle. On the other side were Governor Evans, Colonel Chivington, Major Wynkoop, and Captain Soule. Blackkettle opened the council with words of reconciliation. "We have come with our eyes shut, like coming through the fire. All that we ask is that we may have peace with the whites. We want to hold you by the hand. You are our father. We want to take good tidings home to our people that they may sleep in peace. I want you to give all the chiefs of the soldiers here to understand that we are for peace, that we may not be mistaken by them for enemies. I have not come here with a little wolf's bark, but I've come to talk plain to you." He also said the chiefs would speak on behalf of the other tribes in making peace on the plains. But Governor Evans replied in anger, telling them they should have come sooner to make peace. He accused them falsely of allying with the Sioux against the government. He questioned their motives, accusing them of buying time so they could get through the coming winter. He questioned them about theirs and other tribes, hoping to learn their strength and who had been involved in violent incidents of the past year. The chiefs answered as honestly as they could, but the meeting ended abruptly when Colonel Chivington demanded they give up their weapons and submit to the military authorities. Uncertainties abounded, predictably, when they parted without either side having a clear understanding of the other. Due to political considerations, it was only a matter of time before Chivington and Evans made it clear that any further peace talks were out of the question. However, a large group of Cheyenne and Arapaho, in an attempt to fulfill the government's demands, moved their camp to Sand Creek, close to Fort Lyons, as they had agreed, unaware of the change of heart on the government side. Soon, a series of tit-for-tat raids by other tribes in the army caused panic in Denver. More troops were raised, and Colonel Chivington, with an eye toward a generalship and political office, publicly vowed to eliminate the threat, allegedly promising to kill and scalp all, little and big, as nits make lice. In late November, the crisis came to a head. Despite the angry and insubordinate objections by Captain Soule and Lieutenant Kramer, Chivington led the 1st and 3rd Colorado Cavalry Regiments to the unsuspecting camp on Sand Creek, knowing that most of the warriors were away, leaving mostly women, children, and elders. At dawn on November 29th, the soldiers formed on top of a rise above the quiet teepees. Chivington gave orders to capture the Indian horses and for the mountain howitzers to begin firing into the camp. 2 white traders emerged from a teepee holding a white flag, and reportedly Black Kettle waved an American flag, but the order was given for the troopers to charge the camp, already in panic from the exploding shells. Captain Soule looked at the melee below, knowing that in the swirling crowd were people that he had met in the spring and summer, and for whom he had great respect. He turned to his men to say they would not be fighting today. One other company, under the command of Lieutenant Kramer, made the same choice. Silas had proved himself courageous in a fight many times before, so this was not an act of cowardice. This was a display of moral courage, the consequences of which would haunt him the rest of his life. There is no need to describe what happened over the next 8 hours. You can try to imagine the horror, but I assure you it was worse. Sand Creek is one of the most terrible stains in the difficult history of the United States, a nation founded on the principles of liberty, justice, and equality. Very few white Americans are aware that it ever happened. I can only ask, why? The following February, Captain Soule was called to testify against Colonel Chivington in the inquest that followed the massacre. Chivington and his supporters took every opportunity to defame and discredit Silas over the next months. In the meantime, Silas had fallen in love with a young woman named Hersa Coberly. April 1865 was to be a momentous month for Silas. He and Hersa were married on April Fool's Day, appropriately, as they both enjoyed a good joke. Mid-month, Denver celebrated the news of the end of the war and mourned with the rest of the country when they heard of President Lincoln's assassination. Silas was mustered out of the Army and accepted the job of Assistant Provost Marshal, essentially a military officer of the peace. On the 20th, Silas wrote the letter that I had found at the Denver Historical Museum, refuting all charges that Chivington had laid against him for stealing government property, that is, buffalo robes, taken from the natives' camp after the massacre. Then, on the 23rd, while walking Hersa home from the theater, he heard a disturbance in the street, gunshots. He dropped Hersa at home, retrieved a Derringer, and went back to investigate the trouble, as was his job. He rounded a street corner and confronted 2 drunken men, one armed. 2 shots were fired simultaneously. One of the ruffians was wounded in the hand. Silas was killed instantly, shot in the face. He was 26. Hersa, only 20, was a widow after 3 short weeks of happy married life. I left the museum that afternoon, hoping I had enough time to find Silas's grave in Denver's Riverside Cemetery. I called for a ride, and Sean, a very genial fellow, having his first day as an Uber driver, picked me up. He asked if I was visiting a relative at the cemetery, and I told him Silas's story as we worked our way through Denver's Friday rush hour traffic. We arrived at the main gate, but it was blocked by a construction site. The sign on the gate told us to enter at the other gate, half a mile north. We thrashed for a bit, but finally found it. The sign there said the cemetery was open till 5. It was now 3:45. Great. We drove in and saw headstones stretching in all directions as far as we could see. Sean asked, "Do you know where the grave is?" I said, "I have no idea, but there might be an office where I could ask." We drove further and saw another sign. "Office." Great. We drove up and Sean waited while I hopped out and tried to open the door. Locked. Sign said summer hours 10 to 3. Damn. I peeked in the window and saw a man at a desk. I knocked and motioned and he opened the door. "What?" I said I was from Boston, just there for the day and trying to find the grave of a relative. "Sorry, all the files are locked up. I can't help you." He started to close the door. I threw the Hail Mary pass. "Do you know Silas Soule?" He stopped, then slowly pulled the door open again. "Yes," he said, looking more closely at me. "He's in section 27, the military section. There's a flagpole there. You can't miss him. They usually don't allow decorations on those graves. His is the only one with flowers." I walked back to Sean's car. "You get directions?" "Yeah, I did." "Is it okay to leave you?" I paused and looked around at the highways, railroad tracks, and industries that surrounded us. "It's okay. I'll be fine." Maybe, I thought. So I walked in the direction the guy had waved, seeing no flag, no decorated grave. But I kept going. Then I saw the small flag in the distance. I started walking faster, more purposefully. I saw the rows of small white stones, all the same size. This was it. I saw some flowers. Great. Closer, I saw a car next to the grave, and then a man kneeling by the grave. What was this? I slowed down to approach. He looked up and said, "May I help you?" I said, "My name's Ben Soule. Silas is a relative." He said, "I hope you don't mind what I'm doing here." "No, go ahead." We fell into conversation as he tended to the flags, the border of small white stones, the flowers, the candles, the full whiskey bottles, the lantern, the wreath. The stone itself said simply S.S. Soule, Captain Company D, 1st Colorado Cavalry, 1838-1865. He introduced himself. His name was Stan. He talked at great length about Silas, not so much about what Silas had done, but about what he represents. He talked about courage and moral conviction. He talked about people today who are tearing the fabric of this country with narrow-minded bigotry and hatred. He wondered, where are the Silases of today? He thanked me for showing up, for caring, for understanding, and he wished that Silas's story could be heard by more people. "We carry his spirit," he said to me. And I felt the weight of that responsibility as it dropped onto my shoulders. He explained that the grave is decorated and Silas is honored each November on Sand Creek Remembrance Day by Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal members, descendants of the survivors of the massacre. We stood quietly for a moment looking down at the grave. Then he looked up at me. Did you know that today is Silas's 181st birthday? It was a long moment before I could breathe. I could only shake my head. I thought, I can't believe this. Stan and I exchanged emails. He encouraged me to come back in November to meet some of the Arapaho and Cheyenne and other Soule families, relatives who make the pilgrimage. I'm thinking I'll do that. Postscript. I did go back to Colorado for Sand Creek Remembrance Day with my daughter Emily in November 2019. And in spite of unplowed roads in the foothills of the Front Range, we got to the ceremonies at the cemetery. The ceremonies at the street corner where Silas died, and the ceremonies at the front steps of the Colorado State Capitol building. There we met some more remarkable people, and I realized there would have to be a second part to the story, a more difficult part, telling the story of the people who survived the massacre. I look forward to sharing that with you when it's written. Can you unmute? Are you able to unmute?
Wow, that's unbelievable. Wow.
You can unmute yourselves.
You're all unmuted right now.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody who came. I'd like to point out one person who was part of the story. Isabel Tovar, who was here with us today from History Colorado Museum, where I found that letter, is here with her, and I'm very grateful for her presence, for showing up to hear this story. I had written to her about this day, and we had corresponded some since then. I recommend going to History Colorado if you're ever in Denver. It's a fabulous museum. So we're going to go into questions and answers. So you'll be remuted, and I guess you have instructions for how to raise your virtual hand if you wish to be recognized. So let's do that.
So now we can go into the question and answers or
Sarah,
comments.
will you be calling on people in order?
Yes, I will be calling in order. So if we can use
That's
the
fine,
feature,
I don't have my
the
earplugs.
feature of raising hands, you can find that in the participants. If you click on the participants, you will see a list of all participants. At the bottom of that list, you will see the feature of raising hands. So, and now we have a question from James Hamilton. And if you can unmute yourself, Jim.
Jim is my cousin.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Jim.
That's great.
Great. That was great.
And Joan. Hi.
Hi, it was great. It was wonderful.
Did you see any other souls in November?
No, I talked to some people who. There was a luncheon at the end of the ceremonies at the museum, and I talked to some of the museum people, and one of them told me that there had been a soul who had been there previously who had just died earlier that year, but she said she really hasn't seen any souls, and she was very grateful that Emily and I had shown up. One of my other Civil War stories, by the way, is about Jim's and Mark Soule, my brother, and my great-great-grandfather. Another interesting story takes place in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Other comments, questions?
We have a comment or a question from Isabel Tovar.
Isabel.
Okay. Go ahead, Isabel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say thank you again, Ben, for letting me know you were doing this and inviting me. And it's wonderful to hear you talk about this. And I wanted to say, you know, as you know, the serendipity of all these things, right? The day that you showed up at the museum and I happened to be there and we happened to be able to spend time and talk through, I think is just such a wonderful intersection of where lives come together and that affect each other, you know. And I think for you to be able then to come back and when we let you know that that Remembrance Day was happening, you know, I think for the tribes, this is such an important piece of history. And it is something, so not that it is not my place to speak for them at all. I'm very conscious of that. For everybody on here, I'm the NAGPRA liaison, so I work often with tribal members here in the state.
Why don't you tell them what NAGRA stands for?
Oh, NAGPRA. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so it is a piece of legislation that addresses really a long history of how museums came to have collections, often human remains in their collections. And so it really has set a place for museums to have conversations and consultations with tribal members and to repatriate and rebury where needed. But so a lot of the work also spans into exhibition work and education work. And so we are actively working with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes to develop an exhibit on the Sand Creek Massacre.
Great.
But I think just so much of this is just to speak to, you know, say thank you for sharing the story from your perspective on their behalf, because I know for them, they always say about how this is something they feel every day. You know, this isn't history that happened a long time ago. This is a trauma and a loss that they feel even today. And so how important it is to make sure that we share this with everybody. You know, so I just wanted to say that. So thank you. And thank you for what you're doing to keep this going.
I should say one of the key parts of this follow-up story will be that Emily and I attended this luncheon at the museum afterwards, and we were two of the few white people in the room. So we just sat down at the table with some of the other people there. And I got into some conversation with the woman sitting next to me. She happens to be the direct descendant of Chief Black Kettle's sister, and she has a family story of how it's either probably her great grandmother survived that day with her daughter. It's a story that has been passed from generation to generation. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is to get back in touch with her and to learn more. Yes. Next.
We have now Mark Soule. If
Mark.
you can mute yourself.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Jane.
Has there been, I mean, I did about the Sand Creek Massacre. Is that studied in the Colorado public schools? And if so, are there anything, like any curriculum to use to teach children about it? I mean, it sounds like such a fascinating story, particularly if there's stories of people who survived the massacre, and you can talk about the intersection of, you know, things. But I'm just, is that a widely studied topic in Colorado?
I hope you're not asking me.
I don't know. I mean, I'd never heard of it.
You're the librarian, Jane. You can go look it up.
I know. I mean, it seems like something that would be a fascinating story.
It is, and it's a very important story. And I certainly hope that
Ask Isabel.
that the
Isabel.
yeah. Isabel, do you have something to say?
No, of course I can step in. I just didn't want to interrupt.
Thanks. No, sorry. Go ahead.
No. So, I mean, to briefly answer, I think unfortunately it isn't part of an in-depth curriculum. It is one of the things that, as part of our exhibition development and consultation work that we're doing with the tribes, is part of it, is that we will work on putting something together that can be used in the schools, absolutely, to make it so that it's something that's focused on. You know, I think people kind of go past it very quickly. And it's a problem kind of across the, you know, history books in general, you know, that a lot of, especially here in Colorado, so much of the interaction of what happened with tribal people here, with the discovery of gold, with the railroads, with everything that was going on, and the fact that, you know, they lost their land in that time frame. And so there's a lot that needs to be done for better education to happen. And that's what we're trying to work on. And the tribes have been working on for a very long time.
One of the speakers at the ceremonies on the Denver State Capitol building steps was the Lieutenant Governor of Colorado. And she spoke about an effort, and I'm sorry to say I have not followed up on this, but of an effort that is being made to create a monument on the state capitol grounds, honoring those who had died and who had survived at the Sand Creek Massacre. And I noticed while I was there that there was this large Civil War monument right in front of the steps. On it are the names of the soldiers who had died in the Civil War, including all the soldiers who died at the Sand Creek Massacre. I mean, some of the Colorado troopers were killed, and so they are honored on the front steps of the Colorado State Capitol, but not the people who suffered.
We have now Judy Cole. If you can unmute yourself, please.
Ben, this was outstanding,
Thank you, Judy.
just tremendous. Sort of a technical question about the military. Thank God he did the right thing. Captain Soule, is that of the cavalry? Thank God his conscience, he stepped up to the plate in the most absolutely heroic way.
And it was remarkable. And, you know, he could have been court-martialed, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, that was my question. I associate, at least nowadays, you know, military is so rigid about expecting all this hierarchy of orders and following and never questioning. So thank God he wasn't court-martialed. And did you say there was another company?
Yes,
Also,
under his name was Lieutenant Kramer, was another one of the company commanders who refused to take his company into.
And is this commemoration also for him as well?
It seems to be less so about him than it is about Silas. Silas wrote a letter to Ned Wynkoop, who was also mentioned in the story. Wynkoop was not at the action at Sand Creek, but shortly after that happened, Silas wrote him a letter describing what had happened in great and horrific detail. And Wynkoop passed that along, and it went up the chain of command, which was why Colonel Chivington was there was an inquest. It was not a court-martial because he very carefully had resigned his commission before this really broke. So it was an inquest, a civilian inquest into what happened. But I think between the fact that the focus shifted to Chivington and the fact that the Civil War was ending, I think that allowed Silas to go untried for his actions.
Wonderful. Tremendous story and research and serendipities involved here. Just
amazing. His birthday. It was his birthday
just incredible.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you.
We have now Deb and Tom Walton.
Hi. Unmute.
There we go.
Thank you. As Tom and I were planning our day this morning, we talked about how much we were looking forward to our 4:30 date with you. And we spoke of the fact that we've heard some of your stories before. And excuse me, I said to Tom, these stories come from his soul. And I didn't mean it to be a pun, but they certainly do. And it's so evident in your telling of the stories.
Hi, Ben.
Thank you. Hi, Tom. Thanks for tuning in. Tom actually borrowed the book that I got online about Silas Soule, and also read it and found it quite moving.
And this book, The Empire of the Summer Moon, is my last read.
Oh, okay.
Anybody out there who's interested in Native American history, particularly this corroborates exactly what Ben has said with regard to Colorado Native American history. This is fantastic.
Thanks. Make a note, everyone.
We'll send you a copy, Ben.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have anybody else?
Nancy Ursay is waving. Unmute yourself, Nancy.
Back here. Okay, there we are. Ben, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful story of restorative justice. We see and heard about generational trauma of these tribes people. You were with them as they were expressing this, and truth telling is another really important part of restorative justice and education. So I am so impressed and hope that this story is recorded so that it can be shared with other people. We need to know about this part of our history, and we need to relate to it. So this is really important work and an important thing, and thoroughly heart-rending with your happening on the birthday and the coincidence. And it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't persisted in developing this story.
True.
So thank you, Ben. I really think this is important, and I really am impressed by it. And great to have the connection with Isabel and the work that she is doing, because that way it can spread some more. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks.
As my friend Stan said, we carry his spirit, and believe me, that really resonated with me, and that's one of the reasons that I'm telling this story. This story is a series of, right now, 7 stories that I finished of my Civil War stories, all of which are different, but all of which were connections that I have found during my lifetime to the Civil War. Another one involved John Oberteuffer is here. He's very familiar with another one of the stories that I've written and will be telling. Right before the virus hit in mid-March, I was supposed to have a soiree on March 21st, and I invited a lot of people to come and kind of workshop this program. But Tuesday before that, it was clear that we just had to shut it down. So I'm very much looking to putting this time when I can put this together for a larger audience, and do it in person and publicly. It's now a 90-minute program, and there are a few stories that I'm working on. I talked about one of them.
We have Stephen.
Oh, just one more thing, Nancy. You mentioned trauma. Well, one of the things they talked a lot about during the ceremonies at the cemetery. I'm blocking on the man's name, but he talked about generational trauma and the effect of generational trauma, which is a real thing, and people in that community are deeply aware of it, are deeply affected by it, and it takes a huge toll.
Well, thank you so much, Ben.
Hi, Steve.
Really, really went to the heart, and I'm sure all of us have our stories we'd like to unearth within our families, like you have done and provided us with. It's really been quite moving. The question I had is, do you know anything more about that moment or those times right after he made that decision not to send his unit? This is a huge thing to do. And I can imagine there must be, and perhaps you've heard or you are unearthing stories around that decision at that time. I mean, what was the reaction? What was the reaction of his mind?
Well, it's more complex than I had time to tell in the story. Chivington knew of Soule's and Kramer's feelings about this. You know, they had spoken to him. They had spoken to Chivington before they rode out from Fort Lyon to Sand Creek, and so one of the other officers made it clear. Chivington didn't say this, but one of the officers said that it would be understood if they chose not to ride with the 1st and 3rd Colorado to the Indian village. Kramer and Soule chose to bring their companies to the village, but they did keep them out of the action. The action went on for pretty much until dark and after. It was a very long day, and so those two companies were given orders that were not directly involved with the massacre that was going on. So they were kind of on the periphery. They were able to witness what was going on, but they were not part of the shooting. It could be said that, you know, that they were, you know, accomplices, I suppose, but the fact that he did as much as he did, it was really remarkable at the time and at any time, frankly. Thanks, Steve.
Ben, can I jump in just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Because to speak to, I think the importance of, I think people struggle with the fact that they stood, but for many people, for the tribes, they speak to that if it had not been for them being there and standing by, that they wouldn't be here because that many more people would have died. But also the fact that they held witness and wrote about it and submitted it. So that's a huge part of this situation, is that at that time, even though you see that it's called a battle and all this, it's not a battle. It was a peaceful camp that they came upon at dawn. And so the eyewitness accounts from these people, the companies that held back, that stood back, are directly responsible for the fact that it was seen at that time for the atrocity that it was, because otherwise there would not have been those firsthand accounts. At least, you know, you always see how you have the tribal side and the stories that are told, but to also have these firsthand accounts written down of I mean, the details of what happened are atrocious. But we have those because they were there to see and to speak up afterwards and to come after and to have those inquests done. So at that time, it was understood that this was an atrocity. So I think it was important to have that happen.
That's probably why Soule is more focus is put on him at least the day that I was there at the Sand Creek Remembrance Day, because he wrote that letter memorializing, as we now like to say, memorializing the event just after it happened. And the fact that that letter made its way up the Army chain of command put him really in the spotlight for exposing this for what it really was. Because otherwise, you know, Chivington and rode into Denver with people cheerleading. You know, they brought, well, artifacts from the massacre into Denver, and people stood and cheered in the street for them. So if this letter had not been written, the other side of the story would be all that we would now have.
I don't see anybody raising their
Okay,
hand.
great.
So,
Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate that you spent this time. And as I say, at some point I will be putting these stories together, and I'll be doing a public presentation, and I hope you come and see more. Thanks for coming.
thank you, everybody. And we will have our last Zoom talk next week on Tuesday at the same time, 4:30. Thank you, Ben, for sharing with us your wonderful story. And thank you for opening up to us to that and to that knowledge. So
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome.
Isabel, thank you for your important work too. Very important work.
thank you all.